Welcome back, families, to the American Family Survival Network. I'm your host, Jeffrey Snipes. Another article brought to us by Michael Snyder over at the Economic Collapse blog. During the coming economic crisis, 2/3 of the country will be out of cash almost immediately. Did you know that almost 70% of the U.S. population is essentially living paycheck to paycheck? As you will see below, a brand new survey has found that 69% of all Americans have less than $1,000 in savings. Of course, one of the primary reasons for this is that most of us are absolutely drowning in debt. In fact, the total amount of household debt in the United States now exceeds $12 trillion. So many Americans are busy just trying to pay off their existing debts that they can't even think about saving money or anything for the future. If economic conditions remain relatively stable, the fact that so many of us are living on the edge probably won't kill us. But the moment the economy plunges into another 2008-style crisis, or worse, we could be facing a situation where 2/3 of the country is in imminent danger of running out of cash. If you are living paycheck to paycheck, you live under the constant threat of your life being totally turned upside down if that paycheck ever goes away. During the last crisis, millions of Americans lost their jobs very rapidly, and because so many of them were living paycheck to paycheck, all of a sudden large numbers of people couldn't pay their mortgages. As a result, multitudes of American families went through the extremely painful process of foreclosure. Unfortunately, it appears that we have not learned anything from the last go-round. According to the brand new survey that I mentioned above, 69% of all Americans have less than $1,000 in savings. Last year, Go Banking Rates surveyed more than 5,000 Americans, only to uncover that 62% of them had less than $1,000 in savings. Last month, Go Banking Rates again posed a question to Americans of how much they had in their savings account, only this time it asked 7,052 people. The result, nearly 7 in 10 Americans, 69%, had less than $1,000 in their savings account. Breaking the survey down a bit further, we find that 34% of Americans don't have a dime in their savings account, while another 35% have less than $1,000 in their savings account. Of the remaining survey takers, 11% have between $1,000 and $4,999 in their savings account. 4% have between $5,000 and $9,999 in their savings account, and only 15% have more than $10,000 in their savings accounts. Perhaps the most alarming fact from this survey is that 62% of all Americans had less than $1,000 in savings last year. So that means this number has gotten 7% worse just over the last 12 months. How did that happen? I thought the mainstream media was telling us that the economy was getting better. Look, if you don't have an emergency fund, you're in danger of losing everything. This is a point that I have been making over and over again for years. And in an article about this new survey, USA Today made this point very strongly as well. The data is particularly worrisome since the recommendation is for Americans to have 6 months and expenses saved in case of an emergency, such as a large medical expense, car repair bill, or losing your job. Without this emergency fund to fall back on, millions of Americans could be risking financial disaster. As the publisher of the Economic Collapse blog, people are constantly asking me what they should do to get prepared for what is coming. The number one thing I always suggest is to build up an emergency fund. In a chaotic situation, it is always hard to anticipate accurately what is going to happen. But without a doubt, we are all going to need to continue to pay our bills and to buy things for our families during the next crisis. Yes, someday the dollar will become rather worthless, but until that happens, you are going to need to continue to put a roof over the heads of your family and to put food on the table. And you are going to need money to do those things. Some time ago, the Federal Reserve also found that a large percentage of Americans are living on the edge of financial disaster. They discovered that 40% of all Americans could not even come up with $400 to pay for an unexpected emergency room visit without borrowing the money or selling something that they own. If you can't even come up with $400, you're really hurting. But that is the status of about half the country these days. We are continually being told that the economy is strong, but that is simply not the truth. In fact, it turns out that the period from 2005 to 2015 was the worst period for per capita real GDP growth in modern American history. The following comes from Zero Hedge. Number one, Growth was unusually strong in the 1960s and early 1970s, and every year from 1966 through 1973, per capita income was up between 30% and 40% from a decade earlier. Thus, it's not surprising that many Americans recall this as a great period for the nation's economy. Number two, in every year from 1984 to 2007, a period that economists call the Great Moderation, because of the way both growth and interest rates stabilized, per person income was up between 20% and 30% from a decade earlier. That's ample reason for Americans to view this as a good period for the economy. Number three, cumulative per person growth from 2005 to 2015 was lower than in any prior decade in the sample. That certainly helps explain why many Americans are unhappy with the nation's recent economic performance. And as I repeat over and over, Barack Obama is on track to be the one and only president in all of American history to never have a single year when the economy grew by at least 3%. And he has had 8 years to try to accomplish that feat. Why doesn't Donald Trump ever bring up that amazing fact? I would think he could get a lot of mileage out of that number. At this point, nobody can deny that the middle class is shrinking. 61% of all Americans lived in middle-class households in 1971. But now the middle class makes up a minority of the population for the very first time in our history. Back in 1970, the middle class brought home approximately 62% of all income. But today, that figure has plummeted to just 43%. Those that are still doing well often dismiss those that are struggling by barking out such phrases as, "get a job." But the truth is that getting a good job is not so easy these days. The most recent statistics show that there are 7.9 million Americans that are considered to be officially unemployed. When you add that number to the 94.1 million working-age Americans that are considered to be not in the labor force, you get a grand total of 102 million working-age Americans that do not have a job right now. And just because you do have a job does not mean that everything is okay. As I have discussed previously, 51% of all U.S. workers make less than $30,000 a year, according to the Social Security Administration. Everywhere you look, things seem to be getting worse and not better. Not too long ago, I documented the explosion of tent cities all over the country as poverty continues to rise. And I discussed how one study found that some young women in our impoverished inner cities are so desperate that they are actually trading sex for food. Sadly, it isn't just a few hard cases that we're talking about. Even in areas of the country that are supposed to be quote-unquote doing well, we are seeing record-setting poverty numbers. For example, it was recently reported that the number of New Yorkers sleeping in homeless shelters just set a brand new all-time high. And the number of New York families permanently living in homeless shelters is up 60% over the past 5 years. If things are this bad during an economic recovery, quote-unquote, what are they going to look like once the economy really starts imploding? And considering the fact that almost 70% of the population has virtually no savings, could our nation handle an extended economic downturn that may be even worse than what we experienced in 2008 and 2009? As a nation, we truly are living on the edge, and it is going to take very much, and it isn't going to take very much at all to push us into oblivion. Folks, you need to get prepared for this, and you need to do that by going to the AmericanFamilySurvivalStore.com today for all your family's emergency needs and survival needs. And folks, please remember to safeguard and protect your families. Fear not, and God bless. Thank you so much. Have a great day.